Big week ahead for the Houston Texans. This is a massive, massive weekend. And I know, look, my job as someone who hosts a daily radio show for 4 hours and talks to you every day for who knows how long and interacts with you on the internet, my job is to tell you why things matter when it comes to the Houston Texans. Because quite frankly, they haven't done any of us any damn favors. They've actually made it very difficult at times. Now, they do let us do our jobs. They do let us criticize them. We do get to say whatever we want to say, but time is money for people these days. And there's a lot of opportunities that you have to invest your emotions and invest your time in other things. And the Texans haven't made it very easy. The sins of the past, you see the stadium, you see the lack of asses in seats. You hear what, players have said about the Texans in the past. And we can talk about process over results, but at some point, especially in this city, the results do matter. And that's why the Houston Astros, with how beloved they are right now, there was a time where people were kind of disgusted with them. And now, they're beloved. And the bottom line is, on top of all the extra stuff, the community bond and all that, it does come down to winning and losing. And the Texans right now, they've been losers the last couple years. Plain and simple. In almost every area, they've been losers. Now, there have been other organizations that have been in this situation. They found their way out of it. I think Nick Caserio is the scenario, although I do wonder if Nick Caserio potentially made a mistake that could prevent him from getting where this organization wants to be, where you and I want them to be, and where they're going to need to at least have some progress heading in that direction, not process over results, but some tangible stuff. If Nick Caserio wants to be along for the ride for the entire time, I'll get into that in a sec, but let's just lay out the weekend of opportunity for the Houston Texans, because I don't know where you guys are. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe. Got the comments. We'll keep that flowing through. And we'll keep that going. Someone's asking about U of H attendance. I have no idea. Really don't know. No clue. Probably pretty low. Although I would recommend going out there. I enjoy going to TDECU. Wouldn't mind having a different coach, but that's neither here nor there. But this is the massive weekend of opportunity for the Houston Texans, because I'm at the point where I am number one pick in the draft or bust. And I'm a Bryce Young guy. Some people aren't Bryce Young guys. I'm a Bryce Young guy. I think the size is not going to be a problem. I think once he gets the right play caller, which is something else that we'll get into, I think he's going to be fine. The pedigree speaks for itself. I'm a Bryce Young guy. But even if it's not Bryce Young, I'm a let's get the number one pick in the draft guy. Top of the first round, top of the second, like top of every round. I'm that guy. So I've started focusing on the dream to get the number one pick in the draft. And this is a big week for that opportunity to increase significantly. And I'll just pull up the Tankathon standings. And this is the go-to if you want to follow where the Texans are in the draft. If the draft began today, the Texans would have the 1st and 13th pick in the draft, which is good. But we do know that wild stuff happens in the NFL, and sometimes you win games, and when you win, you lose. When you lose, you win. The old Gloria from White Men Can't Jump. But this week, the Texans, who sit 1-6-1, there's massive opportunity for them to kind of get some more breathing room when it comes to having the number one pick. Starting with Las Vegas. The Las Vegas Raiders this week, they take on the Indianapolis Colts. Indianapolis just hired Jeff Saturday. Sam Ehlinger's their quarterback. They're an absolute bleep show. Las Vegas is favored to win by a touchdown. One of the most disappointing teams in the league. Favored to win by a touchdown. So let's pretend Las Vegas wins. That gives you more room. Pittsburgh. This is kind of a win-win. They're facing the New Orleans Saints, who, by the way, you might not know it, but Philadelphia actually possesses the New Orleans Saints pick. So Philadelphia is undefeated, and right now they have the 6th pick in the draft. That's terrifying. That's how you do a rebuild. Howie Roseman's done an excellent job doing a rebuild. Nick Caserio should strive to be Howie Roseman and do the job that he's done. But if Pittsburgh beats New Orleans, then that's more wiggle room. Detroit faces Chicago this week. Detroit won last week. Detroit versus Chicago. That could happen. And you already had Carolina win. So it's a massive, massive, massive opportunity. If Chicago loses, that gets them further off you. So this is a big opportunity for the Texans to where if they lose, if you are in the camp, and maybe you're someone who just wants them to win every game. I can understand that. But if you are in that camp, this is a massive, massive opportunity. And I'll get to your questions in a second. Someone's asking about season tickets next year. Will they be a better team? I think so. And I think they'll have more faces, more potential faces of the franchise. So yes, I do think that, season tickets would be better to purchase next year. John's talking about Quentin Johnston. If he can't suit up tonight, Nick should have his eyes on him. I hope he can't suit up tonight, quite honestly. I'm a Horns fan. He's a Horns decommit. So I just want the W. So yeah, but I do like him. And I do like this receiver draft a lot. You got some really, really good receivers in this upcoming draft. Nick Caserio, I'm assuming that's not your real name. I don't understand Cooks. He said he didn't want to get traded again, but now he does. You didn't have to sign the extension. We'll get into him. But big opportunity for the Texans. That's the most relevant thing going on right now when it comes to potentially a pivotal moment, especially if you believe Bryce Young can be the face of your franchise and take you where you want to go, which I do. They might like someone else. But even then, if you have a quarterback who you believe in, number 1 pick, sign me up. Someone just mentioned Brandon Cooks. And I've been having nightmares about Brandon Cooks. I fear that not trading Brandon Cooks will be the biggest mistake that Nick Caserio has ever made. And I'm trying to understand why this happened. And again, there's still time to trade him. So maybe my nightmare doesn't come true. You guys know me. I worry a lot. I worry about a lot of things. I was worried about the Astros bullpen till from the beginning of the season to the end, and it was one of the best effing bullpens that we've ever seen. Congratulations to Montero on that new 3-year deal. $30 million. It's a nice deal for him. But the Brandon Cooks nightmare to me is really simple. There's a culture thing there, which we've rolled our eyes at a lot when the Texans have talked about culture. And it's not because culture isn't important. It's because it didn't seem real when they talked about it. Like they didn't really seem to know what culture was. Now, when you have Jack Easterby here and he's overseeing culture, that's going to happen because he's a liar, he's a bozo, and he's a dishonest guy. So that's going to happen. But now you have Brandon Cooks, who's one of your culture guys, who's not even a captain anymore, and he's still lingering around the locker room. Now, the players respect him, and rightfully so. I don't think Brandon Cooks is like some sort of like guy that he's not going to like alienate himself or anything like that to a certain point. But the culture, it's the questions of culture. Let's put it this way. At the very least, the culture that you've been claiming that you were trying to build, it didn't gain any momentum this year. As a matter of fact, it lost a lot. Now, that could be a good thing. But do you want Brandon Cooks lingering around for the rest of the season? Like, let's say Brandon Cooks, and this is the nightmare scenario. We know the surface of why it was a mistake not to trade Brandon Cooks, at least right now. You could have had a 2nd-round pick. At least that's what I was told. That's what other people have heard. You didn't get the 2nd-round pick. Adam Schefter said you wanted a 2nd and 4th, which seems rich. The 2nd, I would take. Now, did it have to do with money? Maybe so. But I find it hard to believe that in the offseason, I know the free agent class is thin. I find it hard to believe that in the offseason, someone's going to give you a second-round pick for Brandon Cooks. I find that extremely hard to believe. And with this receiver class, you look at the AFC South, you look at receivers. Michael Pittman was a second-round pick. A.J. Brown, who was the best receiver before he left this year, he was a second-round pick. Jonathan Taylor was a second-round pick. Derrick Henry was a second-round pick. Darius Leonard was a second-round pick. There have been a lot of really good second-round picks. Now, if the offseason comes along and you get that for Brandon Cooks, good for you. That's great. I just have my hesitation. And I look at the Amari Cooper deal last year. Amari Cooper went for a fifth. And it was similar. Similar tier player, although I think Amari Cooper's a little bit better. And he went for a fifth. And it was basically like a salary dump type thing. Cleveland got a hell of a player. Now, they haven't really got to, reap the benefits of it because their quarterback, we already know what happened there. But they didn't get the value like of a second-round pick. Now, our team's going to be more willing to take on money once the cap jumps up and with the free agent class. I don't know. Because if you're talking second-round pick and you look at this receiving class that's coming in, you got Smith and Jigba, you got Johnston, you got Boutte, you got Mims. Got a lot of really good players, a lot of really good receivers coming out. So why would a team give you a second-round pick and be willing to take on more salary when they can just get a young guy that's making under $2 million? I mean, that's hard to believe. And we've seen Brandon Cooks play. But this is where the nightmare comes into play. The Brandon Cooks nightmare for me is all of the stuff that we've already mentioned. You didn't get the value that you could have gotten draft-wise. You don't get much more salary cap relief. Your culture is kind of a joke right now. You look goofy. Now, was it a Jack thing? Like that? That's the other thing is getting rid of Brandon Cooks. Jack Easterby's spirit lives on with Brandon Cooks. Like if you truly wanted to get rid of Jack, you get rid of Brandon Cooks. But now you have Brandon Cooks, who is one of the Easterby guys. He's still hanging around, and he's scared to say that he's upset that Jack Easterby's not here. So the Jack Easterby stuff is living on. That's bad enough. But what happens if Brandon Cooks? Let's say Brandon Cooks, because last year you watched the Texans. They won 4 games. In 2 of those games, Brandon Cooks had, I think, over 130 yards, 100 plus yards. There was a 2-touchdown game, I think, but he had a couple of really good games to where he was your best player and you won games because of Brandon Cooks. What if Brandon Cooks, you're unable to get the second-round pick for him, you don't get to relieve as much salary cap-wise, and he plays so good that you end up playing yourself out of having the number 1 overall pick. And then let's say that number 1 overall pick ends up being a franchise-changing quarterback, but you're kind of on the outside looking in and you don't get that. That's a nightmare. Like, that's a catastrophic nightmare. And not only that, you have a guy who's basically turned his back on you and turned your back on your organization, who players still respect and like, and he's going out there, he's winning and costing you prime draft spot, potentially franchise-changing draft spot, and you didn't maximize the value you could have got for him. I think Nick effed this up really bad. And I'm hoping that they at least hold on to that number 1 pick, because I have my doubts they're going to get the draft equity they would have gotten for him. And again, I was told a second. I would take the guy who told me that. I would take his word to the bank. So you're not going to get that. You're not going to get the draft equity. Now, all of a sudden, he's going to play good, and he's going to play you out of the number 1 pick. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but that's the nightmare to me. And that's what I'm worried about. And I understand. Shout out to all the people on the channel. Again, subscribe. Follow me at Landry Locker. Listen to me 10 to 2 Monday through Friday and In the Loop. I understand people who say, and this is always the funniest thing about draft talk. Well, you don't have to have the top pick. You know, Josh Allen was, the third quarterback taken, and Patrick Mahomes and Deshaun Watson, they went later. Yes, but you would still rather have the number one pick. You can evaluate the situation. That's more about the misevaluation at the top. You want the number one pick. You'd rather have the number one pick than the number 5, especially when you have all the needs the Texans have. So, yeah, there are exceptions. It's not the end all be all, but if Brandon Cooks costs you, culture credibility, he costs you financial freedom, whatever you want to call it, you don't maximize draft equity with him, and he costs you the number one pick, that's a nightmare. That's an effing nightmare. And hopefully Nick Caserio can handle that. Hell, after the offseason, they get a second-round pick, whatever, charge it to the game. Good job, Nick Caserio. No harm, no foul. But that's my fear, and my bigger fear is Brandon Cooks has a good game, and all of a sudden we're not looking at that number one pick. Maybe I'm overreacting. I don't think so. I think this was a monumental screw-up by Nick Caserio. Facebook user says the first third-round pick Caserio has, he should jump all over it and move on. Then we can watch him work to get his fifth team. I don't know what that means, but yeah, I mean, I think the good thing about Caserio is he drafts pretty well up to this point. So we'll see what happens there. Brady says, maybe I'm ignorant, but I feel like Cooks isn't that guy that wins games for a team this bad. Agree with the other side. Look, I agree with you. He has sucked. So let me make that clear. He has sucked, Brandon Cooks. He doesn't drop that pass against Chicago. Who knows how things change in the end zone. He's been bad. But now he's playing to increase his value. And he still is one of their best players. But even then, like if he doesn't, I still think there's a cost, So don't like take me like stacking up all this stuff as we're going to grade Caserio getting the deal done and the foolishness of it based on if Cooks balls out, because it was foolish enough. If you could have got a second for Brandon Cooks and you would have had to charge it to the game and admit that you took on a bad contract, then that was a big enough mistake as it is. He's already made the mistake. I'm just talking about the mistake going from awful to the worst thing ever. That's what I'm talking about. So we'll see what happens. But I am a natural worrier, so I can agree on that. Something else I wanted to look at heading into the Giants. And look, if you want like a breakdown of the game itself, I love doing that. And I think the guy to watch this week for the Giants is 97. I think Dexter Lawrence is going to feast like we saw Jeffrey Simmons feast with the Titans. But in the big scheme of things, like that doesn't really matter at this point. The stuff that matters the most is that the young guys look good, that the process doesn't get thrown off by meaningless wins. And then that's when we figure out where things work. Like we don't need to break down, Derek Stingley versus whoever the hell the Giants have at receiver. Because at this point, again, it goes back to how I said we start this. Like we got to tell you why it matters. And I would be insulting your intelligence if I just broke that down. There's plenty of plays. John Harris can do that for you better than anyone. So he can break that down. HoustonTexans.com. You can check that out. And they can cuss and discuss and break down the relevance of the Giants. I'm looking at this Giants team, though, in more of a rebuild process POV. And I find myself, when I watch other teams now, because we like to localize it, when I watch other teams, I just judge them on where they are now and where they were, like other teams at the bottom of the NFL. Like I don't watch Buffalo. There's nothing that I can do watching Buffalo and say, okay, the Texans should do this outside of, getting a franchise changing quarterback like they did with Josh Allen. But in this moment, that's not realistic. And quite frankly, there's not always Josh Allen's available. But when I'm watching teams like the Jets, and I'm watching the Giants, and I'm watching the Panthers, and I'm watching the Lions, and I'm watching teams that are in rebuilds, and some teams who started their rebuild ahead of the Texans, so they've kind of had head starts. I asked myself, like, what was the formula for Team A to get to where they are, and how could the Texans do that? With the Jets, really, it's just build a perfectly balanced team to where you're not too QB dependent and hire the right coach. That's what I think it is for the Jets. Robert Saleh, I think, is the right coach. I'm a big Robert Saleh guy. Zach Wilson hasn't been great, but they got a really good defense. They got a really good scheme. They drafted a couple of running backs that are playmakers. They drafted a really good receiver, and they maximized their draft equity. So that's what the Jets did. Personnel, it really just comes down to, with all that list, it just comes down to personnel. Lions, they hired a blowhard coach. They're really not that far ahead of the Texans. And there's really nothing that I look at with the Lions. Everybody says they play hard, and I think it's just because their meathead coach drinks a lot of coffee and, says some interesting things and has some quotes on Hard Knocks. Lions, there's nothing really that I look at and say, okay, well, the Lions are something to follow. But the Giants, I do think that's a relevant talking point, because if you take away Saquon Barkley, and Saquon Barkley has been excellent this year, there's been a career revival, and I'm very happy for him. But if you take Saquon Barkley away from the Giants, yes, they have better talent than the Texans, and specifically on defense. They have one of the best interior D linemen in the league, and they have more, long-term pieces than the Texans on defense. But outside of that, like, their personnel, they're not a 6-2 team. Now they are a 6-2 team, but they are coaching these guys up to their max potential. They're doing it with Daniel Jones, who there's been a lot of question marks about, and they're coaching their guys up to their max potential. And that's where I look at not necessarily what's going on this year, but next year. Because I'll ask you guys this, and I'd love for you to put it on the comments, because we had this discussion this week, and it led to some interesting back and forth. If the Texans and Giants switched coaching staffs and they kept the players, let's say Brian Dable, Mike Kafka, who, by the way, going to be a head coach one day. He was really one of the unsung guys in Kansas City. They miss him there. But if Brian Dable, Mike Kafka, and Wink Martindale came to the Texans, and then Lovie Smith took himself, Pep Hamilton, his son, and all these assistants, and Frank Ross is elite. So I think the Texans have an elite special teams coach. But if Lovie took those guys up to the Giants, you think their record would be 6-2? I don't. You think the Texans would have one win? I think they'd probably have more than one win. There is, and we've talked about the personnel issues. There are personnel issues with the Houston Texans that the best coaches in the world couldn't coach up. And I'm very aware of that. But what have you seen from Lovie Smith really in the last decade plus that tells you he's going to coach up guys to their max? They're not using Derek Stingley as much in man. I get that. It's hard to run man when your front seven's as bad as the Texans is. So I get that. But are we sure that when the personnel is right, if it ever gets right, you think Lovie Smith's gonna coach it up? I think even the most optimistic person could at least have reasonable doubt that he would. But I would bet my life that the Giants aren't 6-2 with this coaching staff. Just don't think it's going to happen. I just don't think it would happen. And again, that's not to say Nick Caserio made some sort of mistake hiring Lovie Smith. I think process over results, Lovie Smith's a fine coach here. And maybe being bad is good and having, a face of the franchise. But when push comes to shove, and when Nick Caserio actually has an opportunity to bring in some of the top names, because Brian Dable wouldn't come in here. A lot of top guys weren't coming here for a lot of reasons. The obvious, the Easterby factor, etc. But even next year, let's say that the Texans have a good free agent signing class, and they're going to have money and they're going to be able to be pretty aggressive because they're going to have all these guys on their rookie deals. Like, let's say that they increase the talent, and let's say they have a really, 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 really good draft, and let's say Bryce Young's ready to contribute immediately on a decent rookie level. Do you trust Pep Hamilton? I like Pep Hamilton. I know Pep Hamilton. I've gotten a lot of crap for saying, what is Pep supposed to do? Am I 100% am I going to pound the table for Pep Hamilton and say, this is the guy that you want calling plays? No. Am I going to do it for Lovie? Hell no. So that's why the Giants are where they are. It's not like a massive personnel gap, which is what we often see with the Texans. It has just as much to do with the coaching. And I think the coaching is what's gotten them there. A lot of times there's like a gray area. There's some teams that have losing records where the coaching, man, they really coach these guys up. You feel like the Texans have been coached up? Watch every play. Most of you do too. I don't. And I wonder how the Texans look at this in the offseason. Do you just simplify it and say it's personnel and Lovie Smith's going to coach these guys up? You might. But if you do have a team that's capable of going 6-2, like the New York Giants are right now, they're way ahead of stuff. Do you think Lovie's going to do it? I have my doubts. Be interesting to see what Nick Caserio has to say. There's been a lot of talk about Derek Stingley. I want to get out of here on this. Derek Stingley and Sauce Gardner. There's been a lot of talk. I know Sauce Gardner's kind of the toast of New York, although I do think it's a little bit silly. I think the quarterbacks that they faced have been meh. The receivers have been kind of meh. Even when they beat Buffalo, Josh Allen was banged up. But yeah, Sauce Gardner right now is having a very, very respected rookie year. But you can't convince me that Derek Stingley in New York getting to play a bunch of man, getting to play for a very, very respected defensive coach based on performance, not based on something that happened a long time ago, based on current performance and recent success. You can't convince me that Derek Stingley wouldn't be doing the same type of stuff. You can't convince me that Sauce Gardner replaces Derek Stingley and all of a sudden we're saying, oh, wow, because I think Derek Stingley is going to be a hell of a corner. I think he's going to be the best corner in this class once stuff shapes up, once they get the personnel that allows him to play to his strengths, and maybe they get a coach that maximizes his strengths. You can't convince me. I haven't looked at Derek Stingley at any point. There have been some struggles, but I haven't looked at Derek Stingley and said, you know what, that guy's got problems. I don't regret that pick at all. So I think the Sauce Stingley stuff is actually pretty hilarious. And it got real hilarious 4 weeks in when we're talking about like QBR and the receivers. And you look at some of the quarterbacks he was facing. Now, he lost to the two good ones that he faced early on. But you look at Rodgers with the hurt thumb and all that. Like, you can do whatever you want. And you got to take stats and make them dance how you want to make them dance. But you're telling me you're going to take a QBR with like no variables in, and you're going to put Sauce Gardner side by side against Derek Stingley, guarding different receivers, different quarterbacks, different schemes, not even take into account how much pressure there is or anything. And we're just going to look at a QBR, a total QBR, and say, oh, well, he's better. I'm not saying that a really, really good corner can't have like a really impressive QBR against, and you can take into account why that is. Because you got to do what you got to do. But you're going to take that and compare it to the Stingley stuff. Seems a little bit silly. I'm good with Derek Stingley. I can criticize Nick Caserio for wetting the bed when it comes to the Brandon Cooks thing at the moment, unless he makes right in the offseason. But Derek Stingley over Sauce Gardner, I'm fine with that. I lose no sleep at night over that. Zero. Zilch. Nada. Have a good weekend, everyone. Weekend of pigskin. I got some college football here. I got the horns on the screen. It's a shrimp cocktail game, baby. Got my HEB shrimp cocktail, the large one. Nearly $30. That's when you know it's a big game. For me, a big game means shrimp cocktail, period. Not steak, not ribs, shrimp cocktail. That's when it's a big one. Big one for the Texans, too, because if they lose, it's going to get real interesting, especially if the Raiders, Lions, Pittsburgh, if they win on top of Carolina winning, the dream is alive. Appreciate you all. Love you all. Have a good weekend. Tomorrow, post-game show will be in full effect. We'll react to everything that goes on. Texans, Giants. Follow on Instagram at Landry Locker, on Twitter at Landry Locker. Subscribe. And remember, no matter how bad things get, we're all in this together. Appreciate you.